Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to all of you, and thanks for joining us as we continue our series of lessons called In the Word, where we take up a different passage from the International Sunday School lessons week by week. And we come this week with Dr. Roberts and the opportunity to explore one of our favorite passages, right?
Another favorite passage,
yes.
That's right.
We've had a wonderful 4-week series in the Gospel of Luke.
Been good.
And it's been good to settle down and follow some of Luke's themes as he describes the life of Jesus. Next week we'll head over to the Gospel of Matthew.
And some good lessons in Matthew.
Some really good topics there, but we get one more good one here, and it's the story of Zacchaeus.
Right.
Yeah. So this is a story that we've known since our youths.
Most of us sang it when we were little.
Most of us sang it, but we promise our viewers not to sing today, right? Yeah, so no wee little man today. But this story fits beautifully into the overarching themes of the Gospel of Luke. Let's name a few ways in which it highlights those themes.
Well, we've already noticed the complaining of the good people that Jesus was spending time with bad people. And Jesus emphasizes that that's why he came, and that really comes out in this passage.
Yeah. Zacchaeus, in some ways, sociologically, is not lower class, but in other ways he is part of the rejected social class that people like the Pharisees and scribes would have looked down on and hated. I mean, just downright hated.
He was not just a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector.
Right. All the more reason to hate him. So he fits into that category of marginalized, outcast, rejected, hated people that Luke is especially attentive to in his parables, in his narrative of the teachings of Jesus.
It might be worthwhile to point out to people that tax collectors in that situation were different from tax collectors today. My father, my sister, my nephew were assessors. And they caught the brunt of a lot of jokes about tax collecting. But that's an unpleasant thing in a way that we pay taxes. But in Israel, in the first century, the Romans controlled the situation, and they levied heavy taxes on their subject peoples.
Right.
I mean, they're famous for their roads and their commerce and so forth, but that was paid for with a lot of taxation. And their system was that people would contract to collect taxes from a given population and bid to get that contract. And then they had the authority to collect whatever they could get out of people, and what was above what they paid to Rome was purely profit.
Right.
So the people of the land hated them because they knew that they were abusing the people and they were cooperating with these occupying forces.
Yeah, that was the other thing. It's not like it was their own government that was taxing them. We kind of chafe under taxation, even when it's our own government that we elected to run the country. Here, it's oppressive invaders, Gentile pagans, who have come in and, yes, brought some benefit. You mentioned the roads and the protection and things like that. But just a lot of oppression and suffering. We talked just a couple of weeks ago about how cruelly they put down a zealot revolt and all the crucifixions and all that. So these tax collectors are Jews, but they're working for the enemy, the oppressive enemy who have imposed their pagan will on the people. And then on top of that, the cheating, the defrauding, the skimming that you first mentioned. And so this is a hated class of people.
Right.
It's very striking that one of the disciples that Jesus chose to be one of the 12, the apostles, was a tax collector.
Levi or Matthew.
Matthew,
Right.
who was a publican. You know, that's the other thing about Roman taxation. They got you in a couple of ways. There was a yearly tax that you paid just for living in the empire, but then there were also these abusive tariffs that they made you pay for moving along or carrying things on Roman roads.
Huh.
And so Matthew was that kind of tax collector, a publican. He sat at a tax booth on the highway, and if you carried produce from your farm or fish from the night's catch or whatever past the tax booth, you had to pay. They had you coming and going.
Right. Yeah.
In other words. So, yes, thank you for highlighting that. What an abusive situation this was.
But Zacchaeus, by being a chief tax collector, would have been well respected or at least accepted by the Roman society, although he's still a Jew.
He's still a Jew, probably would have been looked down on
Right.
in that way, even though he's part of the Roman taxation system.
He's wealthy.
Yeah.
He's got
Wealthy.
prominence in some ways.
And the fact that he's a chief tax collector means he's probably skimming off the top of the skimmers.
Right. Yeah.
So he's upping the price to the people who are bidding for the privilege of skimming from the people. So all in all, Zacchaeus was a hated person and fits, as we say, into this category of outcasts that Luke is so attentive to, and that Luke tells us Jesus was very attentive to.
But not always the poor outcasts. Here's a wealthy outcast.
Good point. Good point. Now, the other thing we want to mention before we look at the story itself is that we have now come to the end of that section of Luke's gospel and that period of Jesus' life that we've been describing all along as this travel narrative.
Journey toward Jerusalem.
The journey toward Jerusalem, which started way back in chapter 9, verse 51, and now comes to a conclusion in chapter 19, verse 28. And we are now in chapter 19.
Yeah.
So we're right at the end. Jesus is on the home stretch of this journey, which in his mind has been a journey toward the cross.
But he's in Jericho at the moment.
Okay.
And Jericho is along the Jordan River, right near where the Dead Sea begins. So, Dead Sea being the lowest place on the face of the earth, Jericho is below sea level, low spot, and from here he'll go up to Jerusalem, which is not a high mountain, but it's about 3,000 feet higher than Jericho.
Yeah. And Jericho not only had this interesting low-level position altitude-wise, but it's a very old and significant city. And it would have been a natural place for a chief tax collector to set up
City of
set up
Palms is a
business.
resort place almost.
Yeah, a lot of people come there. And it's at a crossroads. It's a place where the road across the Jordan from the east comes across. It's also a place where a north-south road comes down along the Jordan River, a natural approach to the capital city, Jerusalem. So, and Jericho is one of the oldest cities in the ancient world. So at a crossroads, large city, beautiful climate, lovely, beautiful looking place. Palm trees, as you mentioned, city of palms. And historic. I mean, we remember it from the stories of Joshua and all that. So it's been around for a long time.
But the context here, just before this, Jesus has come into the town and healed a blind man who has joined his group, begins to follow him now.
Yeah. So the people of Jericho, including Zacchaeus, would have known about Jesus' presence in Jericho because of this famous healing. And so Zacchaeus has caught wind of Jesus, may have even ever seen Jesus heal, heard Jesus teach. He clearly knows who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And it's also possible that Jesus had encountered Zacchaeus.
Yeah, he may have known about
Or have known about him.
Yeah, or when he saw this little guy in a tree, who's that? And it was Zacchaeus.
Who's this guy acting crazy, running and climbing trees, this well-dressed
Wealthy man.
tax collector? Yeah. So, well, yeah, thanks for mentioning Jericho. That helps us understand the background. Before I read the story here, which we're about to do, And before we talk through it, I just want to throw out a little tease for our viewers. For the first time ever, as I was studying through the story of Zacchaeus, I thought of the parallels to the story of the prodigal son, which we just talked about in our last lesson. And so I'm going to invite you and our viewers to see if the parallels are there or if I'm just imagining things. I think it might enrich our understanding of the story. Well, let me read the story of Zacchaeus. It's in Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Well, it's a familiar story, but it has some real important application to us, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah. Let's meet Zacchaeus first. We've already talked about the fact that he was a tax collector working for Rome, a chief tax collector, and wealthy. I want to note the fact that Luke highlights his name, and so does Jesus highlight his name. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. And wouldn't you say it's true that it's a little unusual to name characters?
Yes, and Jesus calling him by name, referring to him, Zacchaeus, come down.
Yeah. I remember in the Gospel of Mark, the blind man named Bartimaeus is the only minor character named in that whole Gospel. Now, it's not quite that extreme in Luke because there are a couple of other people named, but it's still pretty unusual, which gives me confidence in pointing out the meaning of Zacchaeus' name, because I think it's being highlighted here. Zacchaeus means pure or righteous, which is a little ironic, since
he was not considered that.
He was not considered that. He's looked down on, he's hated, he's a cheat by his own admission, right? And yet he has this ironic name. So we'll keep that in the back of our minds, the meaning of his name, Zacchaeus. Now, he has a deep desire to at least see Jesus, if not to interact with him.
To see Jesus.
Yeah, the word translated wanted in verse 3 of the NIV is the word seek, which is interesting because that concept seek is going to turn up again later in this story. He was seeking to see who Jesus was. That's not the only evidence of how desperately he wanted to interact with Jesus. He also did some rather unusual things for an adult Jewish
He
man.
ran,
okay,
and he climbed a tree.
Yeah. Now, we just talked in our last lesson about how unusual it was for the father in the parable of the prodigal son to run, right, to welcome his son back. And that would apply here as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And perhaps even more striking is the climbing of a tree, which you don't see many adult males doing. The climbing a tree. I wonder what lies behind this almost desperate desire by Zacchaeus.
You'd think it's curiosity, but it's deeper than curiosity. It's like he's got a need to see. And it's interesting, when Jesus calls to him, he says, "I need to stay at your house."
Yeah. Jesus says to Zacchaeus.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a mutual need here,
Yeah.
isn't there?
Yeah.
Zacchaeus feels a deep need to interact somehow with Jesus, and Jesus honors that by saying, well, great, because I need to interact with you as well.
Yeah.
And the seeking also, so the need goes both directions, the seeking goes both ways as well, because by the end of the parable, by Jesus' own admission, he has come to seek the lost.
Right.
So here Zacchaeus is seeking Jesus. Jesus is seeking Zacchaeus.
Yeah.
So the mutuality here runs both ways. We already talked about the fact that Jesus has been ministering in Jericho for some time in some pretty dramatic ways. And this may have captured Zacchaeus' attention on a pretty deep spiritual level. He is a Jew, after all.
He may have come to himself, like the prodigal son.
Yeah, true. The climbing of the fig tree is kind of interesting because we're not very many days away from a rather familiar story of Jesus cursing the fig tree because it wasn't bearing fruit.
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem,
Yeah.
just later on, I don't know, a week or so, perhaps past this. And I like to think about this fig tree as one that did bear fruit.
Yeah, that's
And that
true.
Jesus, he didn't curse this fig tree because he actually was able to pluck some good fruit out of this tree, right?
Yeah.
Some human fruit in the person of Zacchaeus. Well, that's that first paragraph. The song about Zacchaeus and the children's lessons make much of his shortness here. I don't think that's any real significance.
Just happened to be short. Yeah.
Yes, except that it reminds us that there is a sizable crowd that's lining the streets as Jesus is leaving town.
Yeah.
And that much like, at a 4th of July parade or a Christmas parade or something, if you're not right on the curb, you're not going to see much.
It's interesting to me because we were at a tournament basketball game not very long ago with friends, and she's very short. And 3 times she had to move because someone tall was sitting in front of her and she couldn't see.
Yeah.
So some people deal with this all the time.
Right. Well, and sure, you've been to parades where you've put children or grandchildren on your shoulders so they get to see the parade, even if your vision is kind of blocked. So we won't make too much about his shortness. I think what's more important is the extremity of his need to see Jesus and the undignified behavior that he's willing to stoop to in order to encounter Jesus. Well, when we get to verse 5, we see Jesus' response. And as you say, Jesus feels a similar need to interact with him. So,
and you were talking about the visual emphasis here. After the blind man in the verses just preceding this was given his sight, then the seeing is an important issue here.
It is, yes. And there's a mutual need, there's a mutual seeking, there's also a mutual sight, because in verse 3, he wanted to see Jesus, see who he was. And that's reiterated in verse 4. In verse 3, he couldn't see over the crowd, so he ran ahead, climbed a tree to see him. Big emphasis on how much Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. Now your point is, in verse 5, Jesus looked up to see him. Jesus certainly didn't need to, or he could have just glanced and gone his way. But there's a mutual seeing as well.
And then verse 7, the people saw and began to mutter.
Now, Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus as he truly was. So that's a well-motivated sight. Jesus, I think, also has a well-motivated sight. He wants to see Jesus. One of the things I've noticed about myself is that if I encounter someone who makes me uncomfortable, I don't really want to look at him. If I see an abjectly poor person, if I see a horribly physically disabled person.
Jim Pearson, who attended Milligan and taught at Johnson University, talked about, he spent a lot of time working with disabled and
Yes.
said that one of the most important things is to look at people
Yeah.
and give attention to them.
Yeah. But all the more because our tendency is to look away,
Right, yeah.
in whatever, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But here Jesus doesn't look away.
He looks up and
Yeah, he looks up and encounters him and engages him in a way. Now, you mentioned the name, and you mentioned earlier that Jesus calls him by name. And when he calls him by name, he's calling him, O pure one, O righteous one.
Yeah.
In other words, I think Jesus is recognizing him and reminding him of his true identity when he does that. Come down. When he says come down, immediately he's plucking that fig
yeah.
from the fruitful fig
Yeah.
tree. Yeah. Now, what about this latter part of verse 5? I must stay at your house today.
Yeah.
There's that necessity.
Yeah.
I must stay at your
It
house
seems
today.
strange to us. He's inviting himself to Zacchaeus' house for a meal, apparently. But it's a necessity.
Yeah. And so Jesus begins by acting like the host. He's welcoming Zacchaeus to Zacchaeus' own house.
Right.
So he acts as the host.
Yeah.
And we're going, then in verse 6, that's reciprocated because Zacchaeus comes down and welcomes him
Gladly.
gladly.
Yeah.
And there's that rejoicing idea that we saw so prominently in the lost parables, right? The rejoicing and the celebrating. So they're welcoming each other just as they were looking at each other and seeking each other.
But verse 7 has the muttering.
Yeah, all the people. So there's quite a crowd that's accompanying Jesus as he leaves the city. And I looked it up, and the word mutter is the identical word to the word grumble that we saw back at the beginning of Luke 15 with the Pharisees and the scribes, grumbling
He eats with sinners
and tax collectors.
collectors.
And here Jesus is going to eat, socialize, with a tax collector / sinner.
chief tax collector.
Yeah, chief sinner.
Yeah.
And what do? They grumble, just like the Pharisees and the scribes did. One of the many ways that I'm seeing this story is like the prodigal son. Now, verse 8 appears to be a little later in time after they've already arrived at the house and the meal has started. Is that your impression as well?
Yes, it sounds, when you read it, it just sounds like immediately Jesus said this, but it may have been after the dinner, after some dialogue.
Yeah.
But there's a change in Zacchaeus.
Yeah. But this standing up, I don't think is happening there on the street after he jumps down from the fig tree. I think it's after the meal, like you say, because the people say he has gone to be the guest of a sinner, not he is going.
Right.
So he's already in the house, they're already socializing, they're interacting, a meal has been served. So, okay, good, I agree that. Now, here we see Zacchaeus' repentance, and this is a good place to talk about repentance, because repentance is not just a change in attitude, although it is that. It's also a change in behavior.
Right, yeah.
A lot of times we think we've repented when we feel sorrow for a sin or for something, and then never take the next step of changing our behavior patterns.
In Romans, Paul talks about godly sorrow leads to repentance.
Ah.
But it's not the same thing.
Yeah, that's good. So Zacchaeus is really resolved here to change his behavior patterns and to make recompense. I give half my possessions to the poor. That's pretty extravagant.
Yeah.
And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, we've talked in times past about the two ifs in the Greek language. This is the one that means if, and I admit I have.
Yeah, since I have.
Since I have, yeah. So he not only confesses the sin, he resolves to make recompense by repayment of 4 times.
4 times.
Yeah.
Way ahead of Hebrew law.
Yeah, way ahead of the law, and way ahead of even Greco-Roman expectations, something like that. Now, I love verse 9 because it's so parallel to verse 5. Verse 5 said, I must stay at your house today. And verse 9 says, salvation has come to this house.
Today.
Today,
Yeah.
yes, today.
Yeah.
In other words, we have similar sentence structure, except where verse 5 says, I, Jesus, verse 9 says, salvation.
Yeah.
So Jesus is salvation.
Right. Yeah.
And the word salvation means a wholeness with God, a restoration of a whole relationship with God, not just rescued from the fires of hell.
Yeah.
It may be that, but it's way more than
It's
that.
that Hebrew shalom. It's not just peace in the sense of an absence of war. It's the wholeness,
Exactly.
the healthiness, the right relationship.
Good. Now, what about this reference to Abraham? He says, this man is a son of Abraham. What do you think why does
course,
Jesus call him that?
Abraham's the ancestor of all the Hebrew people, but he's also the father of the faithful.
Yeah.
And Abraham believed and was reckoned to him as righteousness.
Yeah, the very meaning of Zacchaeus' name.
Yeah.
So in saying he's a son of Abraham, he says he is part of the fellowship of the righteous.
Mm-hmm.
He's come back to his true self. And you know, Abraham was not only the father of the covenant people and the father of the faithful, as you say, he was the father of many nations as well.
Yeah.
And so there's a little more universal
Mm-hmm.
role that Abraham plays, which would have appealed to Luke, right?
Sure,
with his
yeah.
universal theme, God's love for Gentiles
Yeah.
as well. Well, what do you think about the parallels to the prodigal son? Is there something
Well,
here, do you think?
Zacchaeus came to himself, it looks
He
like.
did. He came to himself. He got, there was some grumbling.
Yeah.
Jesus associates with sinners and tax collectors, the way Jesus was back in chapter 15. And there's some rejoicing, right?
Yeah. He received,
There's some
welcomed him gladly.
rejoicing. And there's some running
Yeah.
by somebody. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's some parallels
So
here.
verse 10 is, some have said it's really the theme of the entire book of the Gospel of Luke. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost.
Yeah,
That Luke is the gospel of seeking the lost.
it is. And we're so grateful to the gospel writer for highlighting this aspect of Jesus' ministry. We see it in the other gospels.
Yeah.
It's there, but you can't avoid it when you read
Right.
Luke.
Yeah.
And this beautiful statement here, like you say, is not only the climax of this story, but it is in some ways the climax of the whole gospel. Well, we've been talking about being disciples of Jesus, being on mission, and the way Jesus reaches out to this outcast man is a beautiful model of discipleship and the kind of mission that Jesus has called us to reach out to what's our list? The poor, the crippled,
The lame, the blind,
and the
and
blind.
now the wealthy.
Now the wealthy, yes.
Yeah.
Well, we're so grateful that you could join us for this discussion of another very familiar passage. I hope you, with us, got some new perspectives on it. And I hope you'll join us again next week when we turn to a series from the Gospel of Matthew. Have a great week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.